At my son's wedding, the moment the MC announced, "Both families, please come to the stage for photos," my wife and I slowly stood up, her eyes still red with emotion, but in front of more than 200 guests. My daughter-in-law stepped forward, smiled, and pulled her back down. "You should stay seated," she said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. "We need the photos to look classy." I froze while my son quietly adjusted his cufflinks and avoided looking at us. Then I slowly pulled out my phone and began doing what I should have done a long time ago. If you made it past that opening, you're exactly the kind of person this story was made for. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you right now, city, country, whatever you're comfortable sharing. I read every one. This story blends narrative fiction with something I believe is worth your time. Names and settings are not drawn from any specific person or place, but the weight behind it is. I had worn that suit to 3 funerals and 1 retirement dinner. It was the best thing I owned, and I knew it. Maggie had pressed it herself the night before, humming quietly while I pretended to read the newspaper. She had laid out her navy dress on the bed like something sacred, the one she had driven 40 minutes to find, tried on twice, and asked me about 4 times. Is it too much? Is it enough? Every time I told her the truth, she was going to be the most elegant woman in that room. I believed that when I said it. I still believed it when we pulled into the long gravel driveway of Rosewood Estate at 10:45 on a Saturday morning in October. The place was everything Courtney had described in the planning documents. White columns, manicured hedges, a sweeping lawn that caught the autumn light like something out of a magazine. I had seen it once before in photographs attached to the contract I signed. My signature was on page 4 and the final authorization page. My credit card number was on file with the venue coordinator. $183,000 paid in scheduled installments over 8 months. Every check cleared. I mention this not to boast. I mention it because of what happened next. The man at the entrance was Frank Dillon, the venue's security lead, broad-shouldered professional, holding a tablet like a shield. He smiled at us the way people smile when they are about to deliver bad news, and have been trained to do it pleasantly. "Good morning," he said. "Names, please." "Richard and Margaret Caldwell," I said, "father and mother of the groom." Frank looked at his tablet. He scrolled once, then scrolled again. I watched his expression stay exactly the same, which told me he had done this before. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "you're listed under Section C, overflow seating near the east side entrance." I stood very still. "I signed the venue contract, Frank." "Yes, sir. I have you on file as the primary payer." He lowered his voice slightly, the way people do when they want to seem helpful while changing nothing. "But the seating arrangements were submitted by the couple, Ms. Hargrove specifically. The event management clause in your contract delegates all guest experience decisions, including seating to the designated couple and their coordinator. That's standard for our premium packages." I knew the clause. I had signed it without a second thought because Daniel had asked me to, and because I had trusted that trust would be returned. Maggie touched my arm, just her fingertips, barely anything, but I felt the full weight of it. "It's fine," she said softly, not to Frank, to me. She was already smiling at a couple walking past who recognized her from somewhere, giving them a small wave, easy and warm. 40 years of teaching had given her the ability to hold herself together in front of an audience, while everything underneath was different. I had always admired it. Standing there in that driveway, it broke my heart a little. I was still processing what to say next when I heard heels on the stone path behind Frank. I looked up. Courtney was walking toward the main entrance from inside the venue. She was dressed in white naturally, her hair pinned perfectly, a clipboard in one hand and a wireless earpiece in the other. She moved the way she always moved, with the confidence of someone who had arranged every detail of every room she was about to walk into. She saw us. I know she saw us because she paused just half a step and our eyes met for exactly 1 second. She gave us a smile. Thin, practiced, the kind that closes a conversation before it opens. Then she turned and walked back inside without breaking stride. "No, hello. No, so glad you made it." No hand extended toward the woman who had raised her husband. Not 1 second of hesitation. I guided Maggie through the entrance, past Frank, past the flowering arrangements that probably cost more than my first car toward Section C. The table was near the east side door, the one that swung open every few minutes, as servers carried trays in from the kitchen. The hinge creaked. The draft was cold. From where we sat, the main stage looked far away, like watching something important through the wrong end of a telescope. I picked up the ceremony program from the table. Ivory cardstock, gold lettering, Courtney's taste exactly. The Hargrove family was thanked on the first line, mentioned again in the coordinator's note, named in the floral dedication, listed among the hosts on the back page. The Caldwell family did not appear once. I set the program down. Maggie reached over and straightened it the way she straightens things when she needs something to do with her hands. That was when I heard him. Daniel was about 30 feet away, standing near the head table, with a group of men I didn't recognize Gerald's people from the look of their posture. My son was laughing, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other resting on Courtney's shoulder. He looked confident. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man who belonged exactly where he was standing. And then he looked directly at me. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face. Not guilt, not apology. Something closer to irritation, the kind you feel when a reminder shows up at the wrong time. He excused himself from the group and crossed the room toward us. I felt Maggie sit up slightly. She was hopeful. Even now, after everything, she was hopeful. Daniel reached our table and leaned down, voice low, pleasant on the surface, the way a legal argument is pleasant before it cuts you. "Dad, Mom." He glanced around, checking who was watching. "You made it." "We did." I said, "Listen." He straightened his cuffs, a habit he had picked up somewhere in the last 5 years. "I need you both to stay calm today." "Okay." "Gerald's colleagues are here. People from the foundation. This is a big day for Courtney's family, and she has worked really hard to get everything right." Maggie said, "Of course, Daniel." But I looked at my son and said, "We're in overflow seating." He didn't flinch. "It's just a table, Dad." "It's not just a table." "Can we not do this right now?" His voice dropped another register. "I asked you to trust Courtney's vision for today. She knows what she's doing. These people, Gerald's network, they notice everything. I can't have any friction coming from our side. Can you just—" He paused, and what he said next landed like something dropped from a height. "Can you just sit there, eat your food, and not make today harder than it needs to be?" Maggie's hand went still on the tablecloth. I looked at my son, this man I had coached through Little League, driven to debate tournaments, co-signed his first apartment lease, written the check that paid for the ring on Courtney's finger, and I said nothing. Because sometimes the most honest response is silence, the kind that stays. Daniel nodded once, as if we had agreed on something, and walked back toward the head table, back toward Courtney, back toward the people who apparently mattered more today. Maggie looked down at the program. I looked across the room and noticed for the first time a man sitting 3 tables from the center. Judge Warren Ellis, retired federal judge, a man I had known for 26 years. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not pity. Something more careful than that. I nodded. He nodded back. And I thought not, for the last time that day, that what had just happened was not the worst thing scheduled for the next few hours. It was only the beginning. The garden was the most beautiful part of the estate. I had not expected that. The main hall had been designed for impact high-ceiling chandeliers, the kind of architecture that announces its own importance the moment you walk through the door. But the garden was different. It had been allowed to grow into something that felt earned. Old oak trees at the perimeter, their roots lifting the stone path in places where they had decided the path was less important than they were a low stone wall along the south edge, with climbing roses that had clearly been there longer than anyone currently employed at Rosewood Estate. The late morning light came through the oak canopy at an angle that made everything look like a photograph before anyone had taken one. Maggie had noticed it too. I could tell by the way she slowed when we came through the side door, not stopping, just allowing herself an extra second with something that deserved one. She was still carrying the bouquet, white roses, stems trimmed, even bound with a white ribbon she had bought specifically for this day. She had arranged them at the kitchen table the previous morning in the particular focused silence she brought to things she cared about, and she had carried them since we arrived at 10:45, without anyone commenting on them, asking about them, or acknowledging that she had made something careful and brought it to this place. I watched her hold them and thought about that. Brad Collins' voice came through the speakers positioned at the garden entrance. Warm practiced the voice of a man who had done this at enough weddings to know exactly how to make an announcement sound spontaneous. If we could have the immediate family gather near the garden arch for our official portrait session, this is the one for the albums, folks. So let's make it beautiful. Maggie looked at me. I offered my arm. We walked toward the garden arch together, a wrought iron structure threaded with white roses that matched the ones in Maggie's bouquet, which struck me as the kind of coincidence that isn't one. The Hargrove family was already assembling Gerald, with his spine straight and his expression set to dignified occasion, Diane smoothing the front of her dress with both hands, various cousins and relatives finding their positions, with the practiced ease of people who had been photographed together many times before. Daniel was among them. He was standing slightly left of center near Courtney, his hand at the small of her back. He was laughing at something I couldn't hear what only the shape of the laugh, the full unguarded version he used when he felt completely at ease. He looked comfortable in a way I had not seen him look in a long time. He looked like he belonged exactly where he was standing. He did not look toward us. We were perhaps 30 feet away when Tommy Reese stepped forward. Tommy Reese was in his mid-40s, compact and professional, with the specific kind of quiet authority that photographers develop when they have spent years managing large groups of people who would rather be doing something else. He had 2 cameras around his neck and a folded sheet of paper in his left hand. He had been pleasant during the brief introduction at the venue walkthrough. In August, efficient, organized, the kind of vendor who made the job look easy because he had done the preparation to make it easy. He stepped into our path without quite blocking it, which is a particular skill. The ability to stop someone without appearing to stop them. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I'm sorry to catch you here. I need a moment." I stopped. Maggie stopped beside me. Tommy glanced at the folded paper in his hand, a brief, almost apologetic glance. The look of a man consulting a document he wishes said something different. "My shot list for this set only has the Hargrove family," he said. "The Caldwell family portraits were moved to informal shots later in the reception." I looked at him. I had been in enough professional situations over 40 years to understand the difference between a man delivering his own decision and a man delivering someone else's. Tommy Reese was delivering someone else's decision. The slight tightness around his jaw, the careful neutrality of his phrasing, were moved, passive, authorless. Told me everything about how he felt about being the one standing here saying this. "Who revised the list?" I said. He paused. One beat the pause of a man choosing between professional discretion and basic honesty. Honesty won barely. "Courtney," he said. "About 6 weeks ago. She sent through a revised brief. I assumed I was told it had been discussed with both families. I was told. 2 words that absolved him of nothing and explained everything. She sent it in writing," I said. "Email," he said. "I have it on file." I nodded slowly. "Keep that file, Tommy," I said. "Don't delete anything from this event." He looked at me with the expression of a man who has just understood that he is standing at the edge of something larger than a photography brief. He nodded once quickly and stepped aside. Maggie had not said a word through any of it. I turned to her. She was looking at the garden arch, at the assembled Hargrove family, at Daniel, laughing in the left center position at the wrought iron and the climbing roses, and the perfect morning light that had been arranged like everything else today for a specific set of people to stand in. She was still holding her bouquet. Her chin was up, her shoulders were level. If you did not know her, if you had not spent 30 years learning the specific geography of her composure, you might have thought she was simply watching the scene with mild interest. But I knew her. I could see the small adjustment she made in her grip on the flower stems. Not tightening, just holding on. The difference between those 2 things is everything. "Maggie," I said quietly. "I'm all right," she said, without looking at me, still watching the arch. I did not say anything further. Some moments do not need annotation. Diane Hargrove appeared at the edge of the group and looked in our direction. She had the particular skill of a woman who has spent decades in social situations that required the appearance of warmth, while the actual temperature of the room was being managed by other means. She looked at us, at Maggie specifically, and smiled the smile of someone offering something that costs them nothing. "Oh, we'll get to the other side later," she said, lightly, easily, the tone of a woman making a scheduling note, not a social decision. The other side, as if we were a separate category, an addendum, something to be gotten to when the primary business was concluded. She turned back to the group without waiting for a response. Maggie looked at the ground for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back up. I filed it. The phrasing, the timing, the volume, just loud enough for the nearby guests to register without quite hearing. All of it filed, dated, placed in the mental folder that had been growing since 10:45 a.m. I noticed Judge Ellis at the moment his granddaughter dropped to one knee beside him. She was perhaps 11 or 12, dark-haired, serious, with the focused expression of a child who has decided that a task is important and is going to execute it correctly. She had a small digital camera in her hands and was gesturing at it, while Ellis watched with the polite bewilderment of a man who has navigated federal courtrooms for 30 years, but finds consumer electronics genuinely confusing. She was showing him landscape orientation. He had been holding the phone vertically, apparently, and she was correcting this with the patient authority of someone who has had this conversation before. She took his hands and repositioned them. He nodded. She stepped back. He pointed the phone at the garden arch practicing, and I watched the small red light appear that meant the camera was running. He didn't know he was recording. He was simply pointing a camera at the general area because his granddaughter had told him to hold it horizontally, and the general area happened to include the garden arch, the assembled Hargrove family, Tommy Reese standing slightly off to the side in the precise position where Maggie and I had just been stopped and redirected. Ellis glanced toward us a moment later, not at the phone, but directly at us with his actual eyes. He raised one eyebrow, the slight controlled expression of a man registering something without yet knowing what to do with it. I held his gaze for a moment. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and looked back at his granddaughter. I looked at Daniel. He was still in position near the arch, still in the left center spot, still comfortable and unguarded, and present in a way he had not been in a long time. The photographer's assistant was arranging the group. Now, slight adjustments, shoulder angles, the small corrections that make a photograph look unconstructed. Daniel followed the directions without looking away from the lens. He did not turn his head, not once. I thought about the drive to his soccer games, the 3 a.m. phone calls before the bar exam, the Tuesday evenings in the kitchen when Maggie made his favorite meal, because he had a hard week and she always knew when he was having a hard week without being told. I thought about 33 years of accumulation, the specific weight of it, the things that cannot be transferred or documented or listed in a folder. And I thought about the fact that he was standing 20 feet away in a garden that my money had rented for this afternoon, and he had not looked in our direction once. The camera clicked. The Hargrove family photograph was taken. Maggie's bouquet was not in it. I looked at her hand, still holding the white roses. Fingers relaxed, now not gripping, just carrying. The way she carried most things quietly without making it anyone else's problem. I made a note of that, too. We walked back toward Section C without discussion. The morning light was still beautiful in the garden. The oak trees were still exactly what they were. The roses on the stone wall had not changed because of anything that had happened in the last 15 minutes. But something in me had... The coffee on our table when we returned to Section C had gone cold while we were gone. I picked up the cup anyway. I sat down. I looked at the main hall, the head table, the floral arrangements, the careful architecture of an afternoon that had been designed piece by piece with more thought than I had been willing to give it credit for. A structure tells you what it is made of. I was beginning to understand what this one was made of, and I had a feeling, the specific, quiet, load-bearing feeling that comes before a calculation resolves, that the morning had not yet shown me everything it intended to. The portrait session had barely wrapped when I went looking for my son. I wasn't angry. That is the thing I want to be clear about, even now. I was not the kind of man who charged into rooms with his fists clenched. 40 years of engineering had trained me differently. When something doesn't add up, you go back to the source. You ask questions. You listen to the answers. Then you decide what to do with what you've heard. I found Daniel in the side hallway adjacent to the main reception hall, a narrow corridor, with pale yellow walls and a row of framed venue photographs that nobody ever looked at. He was checking his phone jacket, still perfectly pressed, not a hair out of place. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, something more like preparation. "Dad," he said. "Daniel?" I stopped about 4 feet away from him, close enough to talk, far enough that this wasn't a confrontation. "The seating, the photos. I need you to explain." He exhaled not quite a sigh, more like a controlled release of air, the kind lawyers learn when they need to seem patient without actually being patient. Dad Courtney planned this for over a year, every detail. The Hargroves have a certain image they need to maintain, especially with Gerald's network here today. I need you and Mom to respect that. I kept my voice even. Respect what exactly being put in overflow seating at my own son's wedding? It's just logistics. He slipped his phone into his breast pocket. It doesn't mean anything. It means everything to your mother. Something crossed his face, then a flicker fast enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching. He knew. He had always known. That was the part that settled in my chest like a stone. Dad? His voice dropped the way it did when he was making an argument he didn't want overheard. I need you to hear me on this. Gerald Hargrove sits on the board of an influential legal nonprofit with deep connections across Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. Do you understand what that means? I did not answer. It's a regional body that oversees referral networks for law firms across Virginia, Maryland, and D.C., he continued. Gerald has been on that board for 6 years. One word from him, one conversation at the right dinner table, and I'm on the partnership review track at my firm. I've worked 5 years for this, Dad. 5 years of 80-hour weeks, missed holidays cases I didn't sleep through. One word from Gerald Hargrove. He paused. Can you understand that just today? Get through today. Don't make it about you. The hallway was very quiet. I looked at my son, this man who had worn my father's watch, to his law school graduation, who had called me from a payphone outside his first courthouse because he was too nervous to go in alone, who had once cried in the front seat of my truck after his first real loss in court and said he didn't know if he was cut out for any of it. I had told him then what my own father had told me, that the people who ask that question are usually the ones who are. I had believed in him for 33 years. Courtney knows how to handle these things, Daniel said, filling the silence I had left. She understands this world better than either of us. Just trust her dad, for one day. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, You're asking me to trust the woman who put your mother in overflow seating? He opened his mouth, closed it. You're asking me, I continued still quietly, to trust the woman who had your mother's name removed from the family photo list 6 weeks ago without telling either of us. The woman who looked at your mother this morning and kept walking. That's not... He stopped, started again. It's more complicated than that. Then explain the complicated part to me. He didn't. He looked down at the carpet for a moment, and I recognized that look. It was the same one he had worn as a 12-year-old, when he had broken the garage window and spent 3 days constructing an alibi, before finally just admitting it. The look of a man who knows the argument is lost, but hasn't yet decided to stop fighting. I can't do this right now, he said. I know you can't, I said. That tells me something. He straightened up, smoothed the front of his jacket, that gesture again, the one I had started to notice, and said in a voice that was carefully empty of everything, I need today to go well. That's all I'm asking. Just today. Then he walked back toward the main hall without looking at me again. His footsteps were steady. His back was straight. He looked from behind like a man who had just won something. I stood in that hallway and did not move for a moment. Then I heard it, or rather, I heard the absence of it. I had expected footsteps behind me. I had expected Maggie to appear at my shoulder the way she often did when she sensed I needed grounding. Instead, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I turned around. She was standing just outside the hallway door, which was set slightly ajar. She had her hands clasped in front of her the way she stood when she was in someone else's classroom and didn't want to interrupt. Her face was composed. Her eyes were dry. She had heard everything. I could tell by the way she was holding herself that particular stillness she adopted when she had absorbed something that required the full force of her self-control to contain. Not the stillness of someone who didn't understand. The stillness of someone who understood completely and had decided again to say nothing. She was protecting him. Even now, even after what she had just heard, she was standing outside that door instead of inside it, because she hadn't wanted to make things harder for our son. I walked to her. I didn't say anything either. There was nothing to say that the silence between us hadn't already said more clearly. She looked up at me, and her eyes were steady, the steadiest things in that hallway. Steadier than the walls, steadier than I felt, and she said just 2 words. I'm fine. And that those 2 words delivered in that particular voice, with that particular expression, were the saddest thing I had heard all day, because I had known this woman for 31 years, and I knew that when Maggie said she was fine, what she meant was that she had decided one more time to carry something alone. I took her hand. We walked back toward Section C together, and I did not look back at the hallway. But my mind stayed there, turning over what Daniel had said, the way an engineer turns over a stress calculation that doesn't resolve the way it should. 5 years of work, one word from Gerald. Just today. I had heard the words. I had understood the logic. What I had not yet told my son, what I was not yet ready to say out loud, was that I had been making a list of my own. A very different kind of list. And today was beginning to feel like the day it would finally matter. We had been back at Section C for less than 10 minutes. When Brad Collins lifted the microphone and the room went quiet, I had straightened my jacket. Maggie had smoothed the tablecloth. Neither of us had spoken about the hallway since we left it, and I think we both understood, without saying so, that some conversations needed more than 15 minutes of distance before they were safe to touch again. Brad Collins had the kind of voice that made everything sound inevitable. Before we begin this extraordinary afternoon, he said, I want to take a moment to honor the people whose vision and generosity made all of this possible. I reached for my water glass. Please join me in recognizing Colonel Gerald Hargrove and Mrs. Diane Hargrove, whose grace, leadership, and love for their daughter have given us this beautiful celebration today. The applause was immediate and full. Every table, every corner of the room. Gerald rose from the center table with the unhurried dignity of a man who had stood at attention in front of crowds his entire life. He nodded once, modest, measured, perfectly timed. Diane brought a white handkerchief to the corner of her eye. I set my water glass down without drinking. $183,000. 8 months of payments. My signature on 4 separate contracts. And not one syllable from Brad Collins that acknowledged any of it. Maggie's hand found mine under the table. She didn't squeeze. She just held on. The applause was still fading when I heard footsteps approaching our table, unhurried, deliberate. I looked up. Gerald Hargrove was walking toward us. He was still buttoning his jacket as he came, still wearing the expression of a man fresh off a standing ovation. He pulled out the empty chair across from me and sat down without being invited, the way men do when they have spent decades assuming every room belongs to them. Richard, he extended his hand across the table. Glad you and Margaret could make it. I shook it. Gerald. He leaned back, relaxed, one arm draped over the back of the chair. Beautiful ceremony. Isn't it? Courtney outdid herself. The girl has a gift. She does, I said. He smiled broad. Easy. I know today has a lot of moving parts. These big events, you know how it is. Sometimes the logistics get complicated, and people end up in places they didn't expect. He said it the way someone describes traffic. Inconvenient, impersonal, nobody's fault. I hope you and Margaret are comfortable over here. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, we're in overflow seating, Gerald. He tilted his head slightly. Like I said, logistics. Courtney had a very specific vision for the room arrangement. These things happen. These things don't happen, I said. Someone makes them happen. Someone writes a name on a seating chart. The easy smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it shifted. Richard, today is about the kids. Let's keep it about them. I agree completely, I said. Which is why I'd like to understand why the mother of the groom was removed from the family portrait session this morning. Maggie said very quietly, Richard. Gerald leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to the register men use when they want to sound reasonable, while ending a conversation. I think you might be reading too much into things. Courtney is a detail-oriented young woman. Everything she does has a purpose. Our family has a certain standard to maintain. I'm sure you understand that. I do understand that, I said. I also understand that I paid for the standard you're currently maintaining. The smile finally stopped working. For 3 full seconds, Gerald Hargrove said nothing. He looked at me the way a man looks at something that has behaved unexpectedly, not with anger exactly, but with the recalibrating expression of someone who had made an assumption that just turned out to be wrong. Then Diane appeared at his shoulder. I hadn't seen her approach. Gerald, darling, they need you for that. She stopped, looked at me, looked at Maggie, then back at Gerald, and something passed between them in that half second a look I recognized as a look that had been exchanged before about us in rooms we had not been in. "Of course," Gerald said, rising smoothly. He buttoned his jacket again. "Richard, Margaret, enjoy the meal." He said it the way people say enjoy the weather, with complete indifference to whether you actually do. They walked back to the center table together. I watched them go. Beside me, the man at the next table, heavy-set good suit. Someone's uncle, from the look of him, leaned over with a neighborly smile and said, "Heck of a family, the Hargroves. You close with them." I said something like that. He nodded, satisfied, and turned back toward the front. Maggie looked straight ahead. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she was holding something in that was too large to hold comfortably. "He came over to warn you," she said quietly enough that only I could hear. "I know," I said. "He wanted to see how you'd react." "I know that too." She turned to look at me then, and her eyes were steady, but not calm. There was something behind them, something that had been building since 10:45 that morning, and for just a moment I thought she was going to say something that would change the temperature of the entire afternoon. Instead, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and handed it to me without a word. It wasn't her phone. It was mine. She had been holding it since I set it on the table during Gerald's speech. The message was from Carol Simmons, my accountant of 11 years, whose texts read like memos. "Richard, final payment authorization package is pending. This covers after-party, venue deposit release, limousine service band, overtime. Total $28,500. Per contract terms, your explicit sign-off as payer of record is required before vendors can proceed. Deadline 3 p.m. today. Please advise." I read it again. To explain what this meant, the contract I had signed with the vendors structured certain services, the after-party, the car, the band's extended hours, as a separate final authorization. Nothing in that package could move forward without my direct approval. Henry Watts, my attorney, had insisted on the clause when he reviewed the paperwork. At the time, I had thought of it as routine caution, the kind of thing you build into a contract when you want to make sure nothing gets away from you. Gerald had just sat down across from me and told me in the most polished way possible that my money had bought a standard I was not invited to be part of. I looked at the message, then I looked at the center table, where he was already laughing again, where Courtney was already back in conversation, where Daniel was refilling his wife's wine glass with the careful attention of a man performing the role of a perfect husband. $28,500, still sitting in my account, still requiring my signature. I put the phone in my jacket pocket. I did not reply to Carol. Not yet. 12:30 p.m. Main Corridor, Rosewood Estate. I did not return to Section C immediately after Brad Collins finished his remarks. I stood at the edge of the main corridor for a while watching. I have spent 40 years reading structures. Not just blueprints, the actual behavior of materials under pressure, the way a building tells you what it intends to do long before it does it. A hairline fracture in a load-bearing column. A settlement crack that runs too straight to be accidental. You learn after enough years that nothing fails without warning. The warning is always there. You simply have to know where to look. I was looking now. Courtney moved through the reception hall, the way water moves through a channel it carved for itself. Unhurried, certain. She stopped at the central floral arrangement, white peonies massed at the head table, ivory ribbon tied at intervals that were too precise to be a florist's decision, and adjusted a single stem with 2 fingers. Her eyes moved across the room after she did it, checking sightlines, checking angles. The brief practice survey of someone confirming that everything is where she placed it. Nothing here was accidental. I had been trying to name that feeling since 10:45 a.m., since Frank Dillon read from his tablet and said Section C like it was simply a fact of the day. It had a name now, not carelessness, not oversight, intention. I found Stephen Parker near the service entrance clipboard, in hand a headset looped around his neck. He was reviewing a printed timeline with one of the catering leads. When he looked up and saw me walking toward him, something shifted in his expression just slightly, the particular alertness of a man who has been waiting for a conversation he cannot avoid. "Stephen," I said, "show me the seating revision." He did not ask which revision. He knew. He flipped through the pages on his clipboard with the careful efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this. The page he produced was not printed. It was handwritten on planning paper, a rough layout of the hall's seating zones. rendered in blue ink with Section C outlined and annotated in red. The red ink read Overflow Groom's Parents. Approved CH. This is handwritten, I said. She made the change during the final walkthrough, Stephen said, about 6 weeks before the event. Was Daniel there? Stephen paused. It was 1 second too long, the kind of pause that answers the question before the words do. He was, Stephen said. I looked at the page for a moment longer. The initials were written with the same precision as everything else Courtney did. Clean, deliberate, leaving no ambiguity about authorship. Keep every document from today, Stephen. Seating charts, shot list vendor confirmations, correspondence logs. Everything physical. Don't discard anything. He hesitated. Is there something I should be aware of? Professional habit, I said. I keep records. It's how I work. He nodded and I walked away before the conversation could become something else. The first time Courtney came to our house, Maggie had made dinner. This was before the engagement, 4 months into whatever Daniel called it then. She sat in our living room with the ease of someone calculating the dimensions of a space she was already deciding what to do with. She looked at the built-in shelving. She looked at the width of the entryway. She looked at the fireplace mantel and the framed photographs above it with a particular kind of attention. Then while Maggie was still in the kitchen, she turned to me and asked, Is the house fully paid off? I remember setting down my glass. Not what a beautiful home. Not how long have you lived here. She went straight to the number, or the absence of a number, the clean slate of a property without lien. I said yes. She said, That's wonderful. Real security is so rare. I had filed the question the way I file everything as data, without immediate context. Standing in the corridor of Rosewood Estate 40 months later, the context had arrived. I watched Courtney from the far end of the corridor. She had finished with the floral arrangement and was now speaking with one of the Hargrove family's guests near the head table, a woman in a cream jacket, who laughed at something Courtney said and touched her arm. Courtney smiled easily. Her posture was warm, open, unhurried. She did not look toward Section C, not once in the 40 minutes I had been watching. It was not an oversight. The same woman who had accounted for ribbon intervals and sightlines had also accounted for where her attention would and would not travel. Section C did not exist in her field of vision because she had decided it would not. The same way the Caldwell name had not existed in Brad Collins' remarks. The same way Maggie's bouquet did not exist in Tommy Reese's shot list. A pattern is only invisible until you start looking for it. Daniel had been at the final walkthrough. He had sat in that planning session 6 weeks ago. He had looked at the red ink annotation Overflow Groom's Parents, and he had said nothing. He had driven home afterward. He had probably called Maggie that week. He had spoken about centerpieces or travel arrangements or some detail of the day that made the wedding feel real and close. And he had said nothing. I checked my watch. 1 p.m. Carol needed the authorization before 3 p.m. 2 hours. The $28,500 after-party venue hold. Limo service, band, overtime suite, deposit, all of it sitting unsigned on my phone. I had been watching all morning. I had been filing. I looked across the hall one last time. Courtney had moved to a new conversation, a new table, a new set of people who would spend the rest of the afternoon believing she was the most gracious woman in the room. She had built this carefully, over months, perhaps longer, the seating, the photographs, the name cards, the MC's remarks, each piece placed where it would do the most work seen or unseen. The structure was elegant, I admitted to myself, if you didn't know where to look. But I had spent 40 years knowing where to look. I put the phone back in my pocket, authorization still unsigned, and I kept watching. 1:15 p.m. Section C, Rosewood Estate. Gerald was still standing when I returned to Section C. The applause had ended, but in my mind, he hadn't sat down yet. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, receiving the room's gratitude the way a man receives something he believes he has earned. The vision, grace, and generosity of Colonel Gerald Hargrove. Brad Collins had said it like it was scripture. The room had accepted it the same way. I sat down beside Maggie. She had been quiet since I left, her hands folded on the table, her eyes on the head table, with the neutral expression she used when a situation required endurance. I had seen that expression before over 30 years of marriage. I was only now beginning to understand how much practice had gone into it. You're thinking about the money, she said, not a question. I'm thinking, I said about the fact that the man up there taking credit for this wedding borrowed $85,000 from me to cover a private debt he had hidden from everyone. She turned to look at me, not surprise, something slower recognition, the expression of a woman who has suspected a shape in the dark for months and has just been handed a light, a frame completing itself. Tell me, she said. It had been a Thursday in March. Gerald arrived at 7 with a bottle of Blanton's, the good bourbon, the kind you bring when you need the room to feel generous, before you ask for something. He sat in my study with his spine straight and his hands steady, and he said what he had rehearsed in the car on the way over. Richard, man to man, I have a temporary situation. 85,000 between fathers, between men of honor. I'll have it back by November. What kind of situation, Gerald? The kind, he said, that doesn't need details between men who trust each other. I noted the phrasing. I transferred the money the following week. But before the wire cleared, I called Carol. She called back within the hour. Richard, this account. It's an LLC. Hargrove Consulting Group. Delaware registration, not his personal account. Document everything I told her. Dates, amounts, the account number, every piece of it. Do you want me to ask about the purpose? No. Write down what we know, nothing more. Gerald's thank you note arrived 10 days later. Handwritten. Grateful beyond words. A man of your character is rare. It made no specific mention of the amount, or the reason. I suspected that was intentional. The rest came in pieces. Not from Gerald. From the careful silence of people who know something and have decided it is not their story to tell. A comment from an old contact who had served with Gerald in the 90s. A reference, oblique and brief, from someone at a Veterans Association dinner in September. Underground poker circuits had been running through Northern Virginia and the D.C. suburbs for years, private games built on honor, and the unspoken agreement that what happened in a back room stayed there. Gerald had been a regular. He had run up a debt that needed to be settled before the wedding, because the man he owed knew his schedule and understood exactly what his reputation was worth. The $85,000 had not been a loan between men of honor. It had been a drowning man's lifeline thrown in secret, hidden from Diane, hidden from the community, rooted through an LLC that kept his name at one remove from the transaction. The bourbon, the handshake. Man to man. Between fathers. All of it architecture. Built for the same reason Courtney had built the seating chart to make one reality invisible, while another stood in the light. Maggie was quiet when I finished. He came into my home, she said. He sat at my table. Yes. She looked toward the head table. Gerald was laughing now with one of his colleagues. The easy laugh of a man who believes his past stays wherever he leaves it. Does Courtney know? She asked. I don't know how much she knows, I said. But she knows which accounts are in his name and which ones aren't. I think that tells us enough. Maggie looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked down at the table. I've been smiling at that man for 3 years, she said quietly. I know. Every dinner, every call, every time he talked about honor and service and what it means to be a man of your word. I know, Maggie. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. My phone was still in my jacket pocket. Carol's text had been sitting there since noon, final payment authorization pending. $28,500. Need your sign-off before 3 p.m. band, overtime, limousine service, honeymoon suite, everything that would close out the day for a couple who had assigned us to overflow seating and removed our name from the program. I looked at the message. I typed 2 words. Hold it. I set the phone face down on the table. Something shifted. Not relief, not resolution, but the weight of a decision finally made after a long time of making it. Uncertainty is heavier than most people realize. The moment you choose the weight changes. It doesn't disappear. But it becomes yours to carry instead of the other way around. Maggie reached over and placed her hand on mine. At the head table, another toast was rising. Another reason for the room to look at the Hargroves. Another moment carefully arranged so the right names caught the light. I looked at none of it. For the first time since 10:45 that morning, I felt entirely clear. 1:30 p.m., Section C, Rosewood Estate, main reception hall. The name card was small. Ivory stock, gold script, 2 lines centered between a folded napkin and an untouched water glass. I had walked past it twice without reading it. The 3rd time I stopped. Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove guest. Not Caldwell, not Richard and Margaret. Not even a blank card left by oversight. Someone had typed those words, printed them, placed them here with the same deliberate hand that had written overflow in red ink on Stephen Parker's seating chart. We were not absent from the list. We had been categorized. Guests of the Hargrove family. Guests in the home my money had built for one afternoon. I set the card back down without a word. Maggie had already seen it. She was smiling the small, composed smile she wore when she had decided that a thing was not worth the energy of a reaction, but her right hand resting beside her water glass had closed into a loose fist. Not anger. Something quieter than anger, and harder to let go of. I did not say anything, neither did she. A man at the adjacent table leaned toward me. Mid-60s tan jacket, the open expression of someone who had been enjoying the champagne since noon. Wonderful event, he said. Are you with the Hargrove side? I looked at him for a moment. Something like that, I said. He nodded and turned back to his table, satisfied. It was the kind of answer that closed the conversation without requiring explanation. I had given versions of that answer all morning. Section C, something like that. Just logistics. The language of a man learning in real time how much of himself he had agreed to make invisible. The first time Courtney came to our house for dinner, she had been dating Daniel for 4 months. I remembered it now with the clarity that only hindsight provides. She had sat in our living room with the ease of someone conducting an appraisal, eyes moving across the built-in shelving, the fireplace mantel, the width of the entryway, not admiring, measuring. While Maggie was still in the kitchen, Courtney had turned to me and asked without preface, "Is the house fully paid off? Not what a beautiful home. Not how long have you lived here. Straight to the asset column." I had said yes. She had smiled. Real security is so rare these days. I had filed the question and said nothing. Sitting in Section C with a name card that erased my family from the record of this afternoon, I understood what she had been filing in return. Diane found us at 1:45. She came from the direction of the head table, moving through the room, with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had decided exactly what she intended to say before she left her seat. She stopped at the edge of our table, looked at Maggie with an expression of warm practiced surprise, and spoke at a volume calibrated for the surrounding tables. "Maggie, I had no idea you were seated back here." A brief pause, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. "I hope it isn't too far from everything." 2 women at the adjacent table looked over. One of Gerald's colleagues, standing nearby with a champagne flute, glanced in our direction. The words themselves were generous. The delivery was a scalpel. Maggie looked up at Diane with the same composed smile she had held since the name card. "We're fine, Diane. Thank you for checking." "Of course," Diane said. "Family should always be comfortable." She touched Maggie's shoulder, once light, brief the gesture of a woman who had long understood that the cruelest things can be done with the softest hands, and walked away. The 2 women at the adjacent table exchanged a glance. I watched them do it. I looked at Maggie. She was already straightening her napkin, already resettling into the posture of a woman who had decided to keep going. 30 years of marriage, and I was still learning the full architecture of what she carried quietly. The weight of it accumulated in rooms like this one over years of dinners and holidays and careful silences. This was not the first time. I knew that now with the certainty of a man who should have known it much earlier. The specific precision of Diane's timing, the right volume, the right audience, the soft touch on the shoulder was not improvised. It was practiced, which meant there had been rehearsals, which meant Maggie had sat through versions of this before and straightened her napkin before and said, "We're fine" before, and I had not been paying attention. I reached across and placed my hand over her fist. She didn't move, but her hand opened slowly beneath mine. Across the room, Daniel stood at the head table. He had a champagne flute in his right hand and Gerald's arm around his shoulder. He was laughing the full, unguarded laugh of a man who believes he is exactly where he belongs. Gerald said something close to his ear, and Daniel laughed again, and the 2 of them turned together, toward the room, the way men do when they want the room to see them. He did not look toward Section C. Not once. I watched my son stand in the light that my money had paid for and laugh with the man whose gambling debts my money had retired. And I thought about the planning session 6 weeks ago and the red ink annotation and the 1 second too long before Stephen said he was. My phone rang. Henry Watts. I looked at the screen, looked once more at Daniel. Then I stood, touched Maggie's shoulder, and walked toward the corridor. "Henry," I said. "Richard," he said. "Talk to me." Henry had been brief. That was how he worked. 30 years of law practice had stripped every unnecessary word from his vocabulary. He said what he needed to say, confirmed what he needed to confirm, and got off the phone before the conversation became something a transcript could misrepresent. You have grounds for a demand letter on the $85,000, he said. Undocumented transfer to an LLC. No written agreement. No repayment after 7 months. Virginia law supports recovery. I'll have something drafted by Monday. Good, I said. The authorization hold on the 28.5. You're within your rights as payer of record. Just don't put anything in writing that sounds like leverage. Let the contract speak. Understood. One more thing, Henry said. Be careful today. Don't give anyone a reason to make you the story. I thanked him and ended the call. I stood in the east corridor for a moment, phone in hand, looking at the middle distance. The sound of the reception carried through the closed doors music, the low murmur of 200 guests who had no idea that anything was wrong. I straightened my jacket and walked back inside. Daniel was waiting for me near the corridor entrance. He had positioned himself at the edge of the doorway close enough to intercept me before I reached the main floor, far enough from the nearest table that no one would overhear unless they were trying to. He had his champagne flute in one hand and his other hand in his pocket. He looked relaxed. He had always been good at looking relaxed when he wasn't. Dad, he said, can we talk for a minute? We can, I said. He glanced toward the main floor, then back at me. I need today to go smoothly. I know the seating wasn't what you expected, and I know the photos were... I know it wasn't ideal. But this is my wedding day, and I need you and Mom to just let it be what it is. I looked at him. He was 33 years old. He had his mother's eyes and my jaw and a quality of careful self-possession that I had once mistaken for maturity. I watched him now the way I had been watching everything since 10:45 a.m., noting positions, cataloging data, measuring the distance between what was being said and what was true. What would you like us to do, Daniel? I said. Just don't make it a thing. Don't bring up the seating. Don't ask questions in front of the Hargroves. Don't make Courtney feel like she did something wrong. He paused. I'm asking you as your son. Please. You're asking me, I said slowly, to make Courtney comfortable. I'm asking you not to embarrass me. His voice dropped, not quite a whisper, but the register of a man who has decided something is beneath public volume. Not today, Dad. Not in front of these people. I did not answer immediately. I had been an engineer for 4 decades. One thing that work teaches you. The thing they cannot put in a textbook is how to stay still when a structure reveals itself. When the crack you suspected becomes the crack you can see, you do not react, you measure. I measured the distance between the man in front of me and the boy I had driven to soccer practice, helped with calculus, sat beside at 3 a.m. when he couldn't sleep before the bar exam. I measured it carefully. I did not hear Maggie approach. I heard her voice. Daniel. It was one word, and it was soft, the particular softness that carries further than volume ever could. Daniel turned. Maggie was standing 3 feet behind him, holding her bouquet, her navy dress catching the light from the corridor window. She had come looking for me, I understood. She had found this instead. Daniel's expression shifted. Something behind his eyes recalculated. Mom, I didn't see you there. I know, she said. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges a room. I've been sitting in Section C since 11 o'clock, Maggie said. I watched Brad Collins thank the Hargrove family for a wedding your father paid for. I stood outside the frame while Tommy Reese photographed a family portrait that didn't include us. And I read a name card that called me a Hargrove guest at my own son's wedding. She paused, not for effect, because she was choosing the next words with the care of a woman who had spent 30 years choosing them carefully. I have not embarrassed you today, Daniel. I have not embarrassed you once. Daniel opened his mouth. I'm not finished, she said. He closed it. I want you to have a good marriage. I want you to have a good life. I want Courtney to be happy, and for this day to be everything you planned. Her voice did not waver. But I am not going to sit in a corner and pretend that watching your father be erased from this room, that watching myself be erased from this room, is something I should manage quietly for your comfort. Daniel looked at me. I said nothing. This was not my moment. It had never been my moment. I had been the one with the contracts and the wire transfers and the demand letter taking shape in Henry's office. But this here, between a mother and the son she had raised with every careful and deliberate thing she had, was not mine to enter. "I love you," Maggie said. "That's not in question, but love doesn't mean disappearing." She looked at him for one more second. Then she turned and walked back toward Section C, her bouquet held at her side, her posture as straight as it had been at 10:45 that morning, when Frank Dillon read our names from a tablet and assigned us to overflow. Daniel stood very still. The champagne flute was in his hand, tilted slightly, a small thing he hadn't noticed. He was watching the direction Maggie had gone with the expression of a man encountering for the first time the full weight of a thing he had been treating as manageable. I looked at my son. I thought about the planning session 6 weeks ago, the red ink annotation, Stephen Parker's 1-second pause. He was. I thought about the bourbon and the handshake in my study in March, and the $85,000 routing to a Delaware LLC, and the way Gerald had said man to man between men of honor, and the way Daniel had grown up watching Gerald, the way young men watch the version of success they intend to become. I thought about Maggie straightening her napkin. "Your mother," I said quietly, "has been carrying this kind of thing for a long time. Today is just the first time you've seen the full weight of it." Daniel said nothing. "I'm not angry at you," I said. "I want you to understand that. But I need you to think very carefully about what you've been asking of her." I checked my watch. 2:30 p.m. 30 minutes before Carol's deadline expired, and $28,500 in after-party authorizations remained unsigned on my phone. I looked at my son one final time, the champagne flute still tilted, the recalculation still running behind his eyes, and I walked back toward Section C. The afternoon was not finished, but something had shifted. Not a crack this time, a fracture. And fractures in my experience only ever move in one direction. I did not go back to Section C. I walked to the west corridor, the one that ran along the exterior wall, past the service entrance toward the side door that opened onto the parking area. It was quieter here. The catering staff used it for supply runs, and at this hour, between the main course and dessert, it was briefly empty. I needed it to be empty. I had been an engineer for 40 years. In that work, there is a concept that sounds simple but takes most of a career. To fully trust the right time to shut off a system is before the damage becomes irreversible. Not after the pipe bursts. Not after the load-bearing wall gives. Before. The valve exists for exactly this moment, and the only question is whether the man standing next to it has the nerve to turn it. I had been standing next to this particular valve since 10:45 a.m. I took out my phone and called Carol. She answered on the first ring. She had been waiting. "Richard, the 28.5, I said. "Don't release it. Not the venue hold, not the limo, not the band overtime, not the suite deposit, none of it." A brief pause. "Understood. I'll mark it as authorization withheld by payer of record. The vendors will be notified that final sign-off is pending." "Is there a cancellation exposure on the limo?" 48-hour clause. You're inside the window, so there's a partial fee, probably $200, maybe $250. You want me to proceed anyway?" "Yes," I said. "Proceed." "Done," Carol said. "Anything else?" "Not yet. I'll call you when I'm out." I ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone in my hand. The corridor was still empty. Through the exterior door, I could hear the faint sound of gravel, shifting a catering van, repositioning in the lot. Somewhere inside the hall, the band had started a slow song. Something orchestral, the kind of music chosen to make a room feel like a memory while it's still happening. I found the limo company's number in my contacts. I had booked them in July, a 6-hour contract for the bride and groom pickup at Rosewood Estate at 4:30 p.m., drop-off at the hotel. I had paid the deposit myself. My name was on the contract. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. "This is Richard Caldwell. Booking reference for October 11th, Rosewood Estate pickup. I need to cancel the service." "Mr. Caldwell, that's a same-day cancellation. Per your contract, there's a partial." "I understand the fee," I said. "Please cancel and send written confirmation to my email on file." A pause while he typed. "Confirm, Mr. Caldwell. Cancellation processed. You'll receive an email within the hour." "Thank you," I said and ended the call. The hotel took slightly longer. The reservation was in both my name and Daniel's, a joint booking I had made in August for the honeymoon suite in Florence. 3 nights. I had offered it as a wedding gift and paid the deposit in full. The hotel's cancellation line put me on hold for 4 minutes before a coordinator picked up. "Mr. Caldwell, we do have a 48-hour cancellation policy on suite reservations." "I'm aware," I said. I'd like to cancel the reservation and forfeit the deposit. Please send written confirmation to my email. She hesitated. Sir, I do need to note that this is a joint reservation. The other party. The deposit is in my name, I said. I'm the guarantor of record. Please process the cancellation. Another pause. Then yes, sir, I'll process that now. Is there anything else I can help you with? No, I said. Thank you for your time. I put the phone back in my jacket pocket. The corridor was still quiet. A single fluorescent light above the service door hummed at a frequency just below conscious notice, the kind of sound you only hear when everything else has gone still. I stood in it for a moment and took stock. Authorization withheld $28,500. Limo service canceled. Florence suite canceled. Henry's demand letter was in progress. The seating chart with Courtney's initials was in Stephen Parker's files. Judge Ellis had footage he didn't know was relevant yet. Carol had documentation going back to March. I had not raised my voice once today. I had not made a scene, had not confronted anyone at their table, had not given a single person in that hall a reason to point at Richard Caldwell and call him the problem. I had simply exercised the rights of a man whose name was on every contract in this building, quietly, methodically, and without apology. Henry's voice came back to me. Don't give anyone a reason to make you the story. I had not. I straightened my jacket and walked back toward the main hall. The door from the corridor opened onto the side of the reception floor, near the edge of the Hargrove family's cluster of tables. I stepped through it and paused to let my eyes adjust to the light. The warm gold of the chandeliers, the white of the floral arrangements, the pale blur of 200 guests in formal dress. I found Courtney without looking for her. She was at the head table, standing slightly apart from the group, a champagne flute in her hand, and her attention directed for the first time since I had arrived at Rosewood Estate that morning toward Section C, toward me. She was not speaking to anyone. She was simply watching. Her expression was the same one she wore when she adjusted the flower arrangement at noon, the practiced neutrality of a woman taking inventory of a variable that has moved outside its expected position. She had not looked at Section C all day. She was looking now. I held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then I walked back to my wife. Maggie was sitting where I had left her, hands folded on the table, the small white bouquet beside her water glass. She looked up when I sat down. Everything all right? She asked. Yes, I said. She studied my face the way she had studied it for 30 years, reading the particular stillness that meant I had done something quiet and consequential, and would explain it when the time was right. She nodded once and looked back toward the room. Across the floor, Courtney had turned away, but she would be thinking. I knew how planners thought. I had been one in my own field for 4 decades. When a variable moves unexpectedly, you don't ignore it. You run the numbers. You check your exposure. You start making calls. She would be making calls very soon. I looked at my watch. 3:01 p.m. The deadline had passed. We're halfway through, and I want to pause for just a moment. If this story has hit something real for you, if you've ever sat in a room that was paid for by your silence type, still here in the comments. I read every single one. It tells me this is reaching the people it was meant to reach. One thing to keep in mind as we continue, parts of this story have been shaped with fictional elements for the purpose of reflection and storytelling. If you'd rather step away now, that's completely fine. Choose what's right for you. But for everyone staying, the next part changes everything. Courtney found me before I found her. I had expected it. After the moment at the doorway, her eyes finally crossing the distance to Section C, the inventory, looked the 2 seconds of held attention I had known she would move. Planners always move when a variable goes out of position. They cannot help it. The instinct to correct, to contain, to restore the arrangement to its intended state is too deeply built to ignore. She came from the direction of the head table, moving through the reception crowd with the same fluid efficiency she had displayed all morning. She stopped beside me near the north corridor entrance, close enough for a private conversation, far enough from the nearest table to maintain the appearance of a casual exchange. Richard, she said, do you have a moment? I do, I said. She smiled the same thin smile she had offered at the entrance that morning when she passed Maggie and me without a greeting, controlled, practiced. But there was something different in it now, a slight compression around the eyes, the specific alertness of a woman who has been running calculations and does not yet like the result. I wanted to check in about the after-party authorization, she said. Carol reached out to Stephen about an hour ago. Something about a hold on the final payment. That's right, I said. She waited for me to continue. I did not. Is there a problem with the vendors? She asked. No problem with the vendors, I said. Another pause. She adjusted her grip on the champagne flute, a small movement barely visible, but I had been watching hands all day. Richard, if there's a concern about the event, about anything that happened today, I'd really like the chance to address it. This is Daniel's wedding. I want everyone to feel... Courtney, I said. She stopped. I'm not going to discuss the authorization here. I kept my voice, even my expression, neutral. If there are matters to resolve, they'll be resolved through the appropriate channels. You'll hear from my attorney next week. The word attorney landed the way I had intended it to, not as a threat, but as a fact. A structural element, load-bearing and unmovable. The smile did not disappear, but it recalculated. I see, she said. Is Gerald aware? Gerald, I said, is welcome to contact Henry Watts at his earliest convenience. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, once the nod of a woman filing information she had not expected to be filing today, and turned back toward the reception floor. I watched her go. Then I walked to the terrace. The north terrace was empty at this hour. The ceremony had moved fully inside, and the terrace chairs had been cleared for the cocktail hour that was now long past. It was a wide stone platform overlooking the estate's lower garden oak trees. At the perimeter, the sky beginning its slow turn toward late afternoon gold. I stood at the railing and called Henry. He picked up on the first ring. She made contact. I said, Expected, Henry said. How did she play it? Controlled. Asked about the authorization, mentioned Gerald. I told her to call your office. Good. That's exactly right. I heard him moving papers on his desk. I've drafted the demand letter. $85,000 plus applicable interest and fees, if recoverable. Addressed to Gerald Hargrove personally with a copy notation to Hargrove Consulting Group LLC. Send it Monday morning, I said. Confirmed. A pause. Richard, there's something else. I waited. I've been doing some background on Riverside Trust, the name you flagged from Gerald's phone call. It's not a bank. It's a private lending entity registered in Maryland. The kind of structure that handles short-term, high-interest loans outside conventional channels. I found a second wire transfer in the account records Carol sent me. $14,000 transferred in January, 2 months before the 85. I was quiet for a moment. Same LLC. Same LLC. Different routing number. The January transfer doesn't have a corresponding note either. If I'm reading this correctly, the $85,000 in March wasn't the first payment. It may have been a settlement of something that started it earlier. The oak trees at the edge of the terrace moved in a slow wind. Somewhere inside the hall, the band had started again, something upbeat. Now the kind of song that signals the reception has reached its celebratory second half. How long do you need? I said. 2 more days. I want to trace the January routing before we send anything. If there's a pattern, we want it documented before Gerald has a chance to restructure. I looked through the terrace doors. Inside, through the glass, I could see the head table. Gerald was on his feet again. Another toast, another moment. In the light, the practiced humility of a man who had built a reputation on a foundation he serviced with other people's money. Beside him, Daniel raised his glass. Take them, I said. I'll have the full picture by Wednesday, Henry said. Richard, this is going to be a clean case. Everything Carol documented holds up. You did this right. I had a good accountant, I said. Henry almost smiled. I could hear it. Get through the rest of the afternoon. I'll be in touch. I ended the call and stood at the railing for another moment. 14,000 in January. 85,000 in March. Riverside Trust, a private lending entity that operated outside conventional channels, serviced with money routed through an LLC that bore a name designed to sound like a business. Gerald Hargrove had not borrowed money once between fathers and men of honor. He had been building a debt structure, and he had used my trust as one of its foundations. I put the phone in my pocket and looked at the sky. The afternoon light was changing. The gold was deepening the shadows, stretching long across the lower garden. In 2 hours, this wedding would be over. The guests would leave. The vendors would pack up. The Rosewood estate would return to whatever it was when it was not hosting other people's celebrations. But the documents would remain. They always did. The hall looked different at 4 o'clock. The chandeliers had been dimmed to their evening setting warm gold instead of the bright ceremonial light of the morning, and the shadows at the edges of the room had deepened into something that felt almost intimate. The floral arrangements at the head table had shed a few petals. The white linens held the soft evidence of a long afternoon, a wine ring here, a folded napkin there, the particular disorder of a room that had been performing beauty for 6 hours, and was beginning to show the effort. I stood at the edge of the main floor and looked at it all, not with anger, not any more, with the particular clarity that comes after a decision has been fully made and fully executed, the quiet that follows, when the valve has been turned and the system has begun invisibly to change. I was standing there when Warren Ellis found me. He came from the direction of the central tables, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man in his mid-70s who had learned to conserve momentum. He was in a dark suit, no boutonniere, a glass of water in his left hand. His granddaughter, a girl of perhaps 12 with a small digital camera around her neck, trailed 2 steps behind him before peeling off toward a table of younger guests. "Richard," he said. "Warren," I said, "I wasn't sure you'd make it over. I've been waiting for a quiet moment." He stopped beside me and looked out at the room with the same measuring gaze I remembered from 30 years ago when we had sat on opposite sides of a municipal contract dispute, and he had dissected the opposing argument with the patience of a man who understood that precision applied consistently always outlasts volume. "I want you to know that I saw what happened at the entrance this morning." I looked at him. 10:45, he said. "The security man with the tablet. The overflow assignment." He said it simply without drama, the way a federal judge states a finding of fact. I was 20 feet away. I watched the whole thing. "I appreciate that, Warren. I don't say it for your appreciation." He took a slow sip of water. "I say it because I've known you for 30 years and I know what I was watching, and because my granddaughter was showing me how to use the video function on my phone at the time. She was demonstrating," Ellis continued with the faint trace of dry humor that had always been his register. "Apparently I have been holding it in portrait orientation when I should be holding it in landscape." She was correcting this error. The camera was running. What did it capture? The entrance area, the security man reading from his tablet, you and Margaret being directed toward the side. The exchange. He paused. "It is visual only, no audio. But the positions are clear. The direction is clear. The moment your wife turned toward the side entrance is very clear." I said nothing for a moment. "Warren, I don't want to put you in a difficult position." "You're not," he said. "I'm an old man with a phone his granddaughter operates for him. I'm not a party to anything, but I have the footage, and if it becomes relevant to something you're pursuing through proper channels, I am willing to provide it as a private record." He looked at me directly. "I don't know the full scope of what you're dealing with today, but I know what I saw. And I know the difference between a logistical decision and a deliberate one." I held his gaze. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once the way men of his generation acknowledge things that don't require elaboration. We stood together in companionable silence for a moment, 2 men watching a room that did not know it was being watched. The band had shifted to something slow, and several couples had moved to the small dance floor near the head table. Daniel and Courtney were among them, her hand on his shoulder, his hand at her waist, both of them moving with the ease of people for whom this moment was going exactly as planned. I watched my son dance. I thought about Henry's 2 days. I thought about the January transfer and the March transfer and the LLC and Riverside Trust, and the particular architecture of a man who had built a reputation so carefully that he had never needed to examine its foundation. I was still watching when Gerald appeared. He came from the far side of the room, moving between tables with a glass of bourbon, and the unhurried bearing of a man making his final rounds of the evening. He was speaking to a group of guests near the window, something about legacy, I gathered from the posture of the people listening, the attentive lean of an audience receiving wisdom. The word family appeared twice in what I could read of his gestures. Then he turned toward the room, and he saw Warren Ellis standing beside me. The change was small, a half-step that shortened a trajectory that adjusted. His eyes moved from Ellis to me and back to Ellis, with a speed that was almost invisible, almost. The bourbon glass stilled in his hand for 1 beat. Then he turned and walked toward the opposite side of the room, slightly faster than before. Ellis watched him go. "He recognized me," Ellis said quietly. "We served on the same Veterans Committee. 3 years ago, I believe. A funding review for the Northern Virginia chapter. A pause measured and precise. He gave a very polished speech about integrity in public service. I said nothing. He knows I don't forget faces, Ellis said. The band played on. The dance floor filled. Across the room, Gerald had found a new group of guests and was already rebuilding his posture, shoulders. Back chin lifted the practiced ease of a man who understood that the best response to exposure is to immediately occupy new ground. But his glass, I noticed, did not refill. I came back to Maggie with everything. Not a summary. Not a careful selection of what she needed to know and what she could be spared. Everything. I sat down beside her at the Section C table, the ivory name card still between us. Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove guessed in gold script, undisturbed, since I had set it back down 4 hours ago, and I told her all of it in the order it had happened. The 3 calls. Carol's confirmation that the $28,500 authorization had been formally withheld. The limo cancellation and the partial fee I had agreed to absorb. The bridal suite at the hotel 3 nights deposit forfeited. Henry's demand letter addressed to Gerald personally going out Monday morning. The second transfer $14,000 in January, 2 months before the 85, same LL, see different routing number, same absence of documentation. Riverside Trust, the Maryland lending entity that operated outside conventional channels, and serviced the kind of debt a man builds when he believes his reputation is insurance enough against consequence. And then Warren Ellis, the footage, the landscape orientation and the granddaughter's correction and the entrance area captured in 30 seconds of accidental video. The Veterans Committee 3 years ago. The way Gerald's bourbon glass had gone completely still when he crossed the room and understood, in the space of 2 seconds, exactly what he was looking at. Maggie listened without interrupting once. She had always been the better listener between us. I spoke in structures. Cause and effect, sequence and consequence, the clean logical chain that an engineer builds. Because ambiguity is expensive and precision is survival. She listened the way she had listened to 30 years of children in her classroom, completely without hurry, without the need to occupy the silence between words with her own voice. Her hands were folded on the table. Her bouquet sat beside her water glass, the white roses slightly wilted from 6 hours in a warm room. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. The band was playing something slow at the far end of the room. The chandeliers had dimmed further into their evening gold. At the head table, Gerald was speaking with a group of guests, gesturing with the ease of a man who had not yet received the information that would change the geometry of his evening. Maggie looked at the name card between us. Then she looked at me. "Are we leaving?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She reached for the bouquet. "Then let's not make it a scene," she said. We walked out the way we had walked in. Through the main corridor, past the service entrance, into the reception floor. I chose the direct route deliberately. Not a back hallway, not a side exit, not the service door I had used twice during the afternoon to make phone calls in private. We walked through the center of the room at the unhurried pace of 2 people who had somewhere to be, and no obligation to explain where. A few heads turned. A woman in a blue dress near the bar glanced up from her conversation. One of Gerald's colleagues, the tall man in the gray suit who had leaned toward Courtney at the head table, during the luncheon, tracked our movement for 3 seconds before returning to whatever he had been saying. 2 of the younger guests near the dance floor noticed, without registering, why they had noticed. No one spoke to us. No one called our names. No one asked where we were going or whether we were coming back. I had spent 35 years in rooms where my presence was the structural guarantee, the signature on the contract, the name on the authorization, the number in the account that made other numbers possible. I had learned over those years that the most consequential thing a man can do in a room is leave it without asking permission, without apology, without the backward glance that invites someone to stop you. I did not look back. Maggie did. She stopped at the main entrance, the wide doorway where Frank Dillon had stood at 10:45 with his tablet, where the morning had announced itself with the words Section C overflow, seating where Maggie had smiled, her small, composed smile, and followed me toward a table near the side door without saying a word about any of it. She stopped there and turned. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be noticed by anyone who wasn't watching for it. I did not rush her. I understood what she was doing, and I understood why, and I knew better than to interrupt it with practicality or comfort. This was not grief. This was not the hesitation of a woman who had changed her mind. This was Maggie Caldwell, doing the things she had done every year at the end of the school term, standing in the doorway of her classroom and looking at it one final time before summer, imprinting the details, because she was a woman who believed that the things you have lived through deserve to be remembered accurately, not softened by distance. She looked at the chandeliers, the white peonies massed at the head table a few petals shed, now on the white linen, the dance floor where Daniel and Courtney moved in the amber light, his hand at her waist, her hand on his shoulder, both of them exactly where they had planned to be. The program on the registration table near the entrance, Hargrove 4 times on the front page, Caldwell not once. She looked at all of it. Then she turned and walked through the door. The parking area was quiet. The late afternoon had gone amber and long shadowed the oak trees at the perimeter, stretching their shapes across the gravel. The catering vans had repositioned for the evening. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint sweetness of the vineyard on the hill beyond the estate wall, the particular scent of a California autumn afternoon that would attach itself, I suspected, to this day for the rest of our lives. I walked Maggie to the passenger side and opened the door. She paused before getting in one hand on the doorframe, looking at the bouquet in her other hand. The white roses she had arranged the previous morning at the kitchen table, the stems trimmed and bound with a white ribbon she had bought specifically for today. She had carried them since 10:45, without anyone photographing them, without anyone asking about them, without anyone acknowledging that she had made something careful, and brought it to a room that had decided in advance that she would not be seen. "Richard," she said. "Yes." She looked at the roses for a moment longer, then at me. "I want you to know that I'm not sad," she said. "Not the way you might think. I'm something else." "What are you—" She considered the question with the full seriousness it deserved. No deflection, no quick reassurance. The honest pause of a woman who had learned, over 30 years, that the accurate answer was always worth the extra moment it took to find. "Finished," she said. "I'm finished with this particular thing." She got in. I closed the door quietly and walked around to the driver's side. I'd just settled into the seat when the phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I took it out. Courtney. A call, not a text. The timing was exact. She had watched us leave the entrance and waited until we had cleared the main doorway before dialing, which told me everything about how carefully she had been tracking the afternoon. She had known the moment we stood up. She had counted the seconds. I looked at the screen. I thought about the red ink annotation and the shot list revised 6 weeks ago, and the name card in gold script, and the vision, grace, and generosity of a family that had built its afternoon on a foundation that was not theirs. I put the phone back in my pocket. I started the engine. The gravel shifted under the tires as we pulled away from the space. The estate's iron gate passed on either side. The main road opened ahead, 2 empty lanes running through the amber wine country toward the highway and whatever came next. Maggie held the bouquet in her lap and looked straight ahead. I looked straight ahead. Behind us, Rosewood Estate receded in the mirror, the white columns, the oak trees, the warm light in the tall windows where 200 guests were completing an afternoon they would describe afterward as beautiful. The phone did not ring again, but it would. I knew it would, and when it did, I would not be the man who had walked into that entrance at 10:45, name in hand, waiting to be placed. I would be someone else entirely. I had called Gerald at 8 o'clock the previous evening. He had answered on the 3rd ring, which told me he had seen my name on the screen, and spent 2 rings deciding how to handle it. His voice was controlled the way it was always controlled, the practiced register of a man who had spent decades in rooms, where composure was currency. "Richard," he said, "hell of a day." "I'd like to meet tomorrow morning," I said. 9 o'clock. The Marriott on Jefferson, lobby. A pause. "Is everything all right? I have some paperwork I'd like to go over with you," I said. "It won't take long." Another pause, longer this time, the specific silence of a man running a calculation he had been hoping to avoid. "I'll be there," he said. The Marriott lobby at 9 on a Sunday morning was quiet, in the way that hotel lobbies are quiet when the weekend guests have not yet checked out, and the business travelers have not yet arrived. A few people with coffee near the window. A family with luggage near the elevator bank. The particular suspended quality of a space between one thing and the next. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the far wall. Good sightlines to the entrance away from the main foot traffic, close enough to the lobby bar that our conversation would have ambient cover, without being in earshot of the front desk. Gerald arrived at 9 exactly. He was in civilian clothes, khaki trousers, a navy blazer, no tie. He looked like what he always looked like, a man of standing, composed, unhurried, the kind of man a stranger would assume had nothing to apologize for. He spotted me from the entrance and crossed the lobby with his usual bearing. He did not offer his hand. I did not stand. He sat down across from me and looked at the manila folder on the table between us. "Richard," he said. "Gerald," I said. "Thank you for coming." I opened the folder. Inside were 3 pages printed and organized by Carol, with the precision I had come to rely on over 11 years of working together. Clean columns, clear dates, amounts in bold. January 14th, I said, turning the first page toward him. "A wire transfer of $14,000 from a joint account I hold with my wife. Destination Hargrove Consulting Group. LLC Delaware registration. No invoice. No written agreement. No stated purpose." Gerald looked at the page. He said nothing. March 7th. I said, turning the second page. "A wire transfer of $85,000. Same origin, same destination, same absence of documentation. You came to my home with a bottle of bourbon and asked for it, man to man. I gave it to you." I let that sit for a moment. "The third page," I said, is a summary prepared by my accountant. "Combined principal, $99,000. Statutory interest calculated under Virginia law from the dates of transfer. The total, as of this morning, is noted at the bottom." Gerald looked at the third page. His jaw was set. His hands were on the table flat, the deliberate stillness of a man concentrating on not reacting. "Richard," he said finally, his voice low, "this was a contribution between family, between men who... A contribution doesn't go to an LLC, Gerald." He stopped. I kept my voice level. No heat, no edge, no performance. Just the facts stated clearly, the way you state a load calculation to a client who is asked why the numbers are what they are. "A contribution goes to a person," I said. "It goes to an account with a name on it. It comes with a conversation about what it's for. What you gave me was a story about honor and family and temporary situations. What you gave my accountant was a Delaware LLC with no corresponding invoice and no repayment in 7 months." I closed the folder and placed my hands on top of it. "My attorney will send a formal demand letter Monday morning. I want you to be prepared for that." Diane appeared at 9:18. She came from the direction of the elevator bank, which meant Gerald had told her where he was going, and she had come down on her own timeline, not his. She was dressed, composed her handbag over one arm. She looked at the table, at the folder, at Gerald's face, and she sat down without being invited. No one spoke for a moment. Then Diane said, "How much?" Gerald looked at her. "Diane, how much, Gerald?" It was the voice of a woman who had been waiting for a specific number for a long time, and had decided that today was the day she would have it. Not anger. Something colder than anger. The particular temperature of a woman who has suspected a shape in the dark for months, and has just been handed a light. The same expression I had watched move across Maggie's face 2 days ago in Section C. I turned the third page toward her. She looked at it. Her face did not collapse. It did not flush. It simply settled, the way a structure settles when the last load is applied and the full weight becomes visible for the first time. $99,000, routed through an LLC, with no documentation and no repayment. She set the page back down on the table. Gerald was looking at her, not at me, not at the folder, at Diane. And in that look, in the specific quality of fear that moved behind his eyes when he turned to his wife, I saw something I had not expected to find at this table on this Sunday morning. It was not the fear of a lawsuit. It was not the fear of a demand letter or a routing number or a Veterans Committee hearing. It was the older, simpler fear of a man who has kept something from the person whose opinion of him has always mattered most. Gerald Hargrove was more afraid of his wife than he was of my attorney. I picked up my coffee cup and said nothing further. The lobby moved around us, quiet, unhurried, indifferent. The folder sat on the table between us like a fact that had been waiting patiently for the right morning to become undeniable. The doorbell rang at 2 in the afternoon. I was in the study going over the notes Carol had emailed that morning, the full documentation package she had compiled for Henry Clean and chronological, every transfer dated and sourced. Maggie was in the kitchen. I heard the bell, heard her footsteps pause, and then heard the particular silence that means the person at the door is someone unexpected. I came out of the study. Daniel was standing in the doorway. No Courtney. No overnight bag. No pretense of a scheduled visit. Just my son in the same clothes he had likely been wearing since the previous evening, a dark jacket, open collar, the specific dishevelment of a man who had not slept the way he had expected to. He looked at me the way he had not looked at me in a long time, without the calculation, without the managed distance he had been maintaining since well before the wedding. "Can I come in?" he said. "Yes," I said. He sat in the armchair by the window, the one he had claimed as his since he was 12 years old, the one with the worn patch on the left armrest, where he used to hook his elbow while doing homework. He sat in it now with his hands between his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment before looking at me. I sat across from him and waited. He did not ask about Courtney. He did not ask about the wedding. He said, "Gerald called me this morning." "I expected he would," I said. "He told me you met at the Marriott." A pause. "He didn't tell me what was in the folder." "No," I said, "he wouldn't." Daniel looked at me steadily. "Tell me." So I told him. I laid it out the same way I had laid it out for Gerald January. Transfer March. Transfer. LLC. Routing Carol's documentation, Henry's demand letter, going out tomorrow morning. I told it without editorial, without the weight of accusation in my voice. Just the sequence of events, in order the way facts present themselves when they have been properly recorded. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Did Mom know about the money the whole time?" "No," and I said, "I told her yesterday, in Section C." He absorbed that. I watched it move through him, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow and thorough quality of something working its way into a load-bearing place. The fact that Maggie had sat beside me through Brad Collins' remarks and the name card and Diane's second approach, and all of it without knowing about the $99,000. That she had carried that afternoon on its own terms, without the additional weight of a financial betrayal layered beneath it, and that she had still ended up at the parking lot, saying I'm finished with the white roses in her hands. Daniel put his face in his hands for a moment. Not performance, not drama. The brief private gesture of a man recalibrating something he had gotten badly wrong. Maggie came in from the kitchen. She had not known he was here, I could tell by the way she stopped in the doorway, a dish towel in her hands, looking at her son in the armchair, with the expression of a woman who has prepared herself for one kind of afternoon and been handed another. She looked at Daniel. She looked at me. Daniel stood up. He did not move toward her immediately. He stood in front of the armchair and looked at his mother across the room, this woman who had arranged white roses on the kitchen counter the previous morning, who had carried them for 6 hours without anyone photographing them, who had stood outside a frame and smiled, the small, composed smile, and said, "We're fine, Diane, and I'm finished, and nothing in between that wasn't absolutely necessary." "Mom," he said, "I saw your bouquet on the counter this morning, the white roses." Maggie looked at him. "I drove past the house on the way here," he said. "I could see them through the kitchen window. You must have put them in a glass when you got home." She said nothing. "I stood there for a while," Daniel said, "before I rang the bell." He paused. "I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that you made those for yesterday, that you carried them the whole day, and nobody—" He stopped, started again. "Nobody asked about them once." Maggie was still for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and sat down on the sofa, not next to him, not reaching for him, just sitting down in the same room, in the same light, in the proximity that was its own kind of statement. Daniel sat back down in the armchair. The three of us were quiet together for the first time since before the wedding. Then Daniel said something I had not asked for and had not expected. "I saw the seating chart before the wedding." I looked at him. "Not the final version," he said. "A draft. 6 weeks ago at the planning session. I saw where Courtney had put you, and Mom, and I told myself it was her domain, her decision, her family's event to organize." He looked at his hands. I told myself a lot of things that were easier than saying something. The room held that admission for a moment. I did not respond to it immediately. I let it be what it was not, a verdict. Not an absolution, just a fact, finally in the room where it belonged, stated by the only person who could have stated it. Maggie looked at her son. She did not speak, but she did not look away. Daniel raised his eyes to me. "What happens now, Dad?" I looked at Maggie, at the dish towel still in her hands, the kitchen light still on behind her. At 30 years of mornings and dinners and report cards and late phone calls, and the specific patience of a woman who had believed consistently and without demand that the people she loved were worth the effort of staying. I looked back at my son. "That," I said, "depends entirely on you." Henry's office had not changed in the 12 years I had been his client. The same mahogany desk, the same wall of case files behind him, the same framed photograph of the Potomac in winter on the wall to his left. Henry Watts was the kind of attorney who understood that consistency communicated competence, that a client who had been sitting across from the same desk for a decade arrived with a baseline of trust already established, and that trust was worth more than any interior decorator's recommendation. He had coffee waiting when I arrived. "Sit down," he said. "I have the full picture." He opened the file. Carol's documentation was there, printed, tabbed, organized, with the clean precision I had come to expect from 11 years of working with her. Henry walked me through it methodically, the way he walked through everything, without drama, without editorial, with the unadorned clarity of a man presenting facts to a client who was paying him to do exactly that. January 14th, $14,000. Wire transfer from the joint account to Hargrove Consulting Group, LLC, Delaware registration. No invoice, no written agreement, no stated purpose. March 7th, $85,000. Same origin, same destination, same absence of documentation. Combined principal $99,000. Statutory interest accrued under Virginia law from the respective transfer dates. Riverside Trust. Henry said, turning to the third tab. "I've been able to confirm the entity. It's a Maryland-registered private lending company, the kind of structure that operates outside conventional banking channels, short-term high-interest collateral arrangements that don't appear in standard credit reporting. It services a specific clientele." "Gambling debts," I said. "Among other things," Henry said carefully, "the connection between Riverside Trust and underground poker circuits in Northern Virginia and the D.C. suburbs is not something I can document formally, but the routing pattern is consistent with what Carol found: 2 transfers from your account to an LLC that then made corresponding outbound transfers to a Riverside Trust account within 72 hours of receipt." I looked at the routing documentation. Gerald had used my money as a pass-through. The LLC had not been the destination, it had been the mechanism. A layer of separation between my account and a debt that could not, under any circumstances, be traced back to Colonel Gerald Hargrove, by name. "The demand letter went out Monday morning," I said. 8:45 a.m., Henry said. "Addressed to Gerald Hargrove personally, with copy notation to the LLC. Certified mail and electronic delivery. He has 14 days to respond under Virginia law." He paused. "Which brings me to the second thing." He set down the file. "Warren Ellis called this office yesterday afternoon." I had not told Ellis to call Henry. I had given him Henry's name at the reception, a single mention in the context of if it becomes relevant to something you're pursuing through proper channels. Ellis had filed it and acted on it in his own time, on his own judgment, the way a former federal judge acts when he has decided that something is his business. He provided the footage voluntarily. Henry said, "Visual only, no audio, approximately 40 seconds. Entrance area of Rosewood Estate, 10:45 a.m., October 11th. Frank Dillon directing you and Margaret to Section C. The tablet is visible. The exchange is clear." He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "It is as Ellis described, unambiguous." "Did he say anything else?" Henry leaned back slightly. "He mentioned that Gerald Hargrove has been nominated for the Veterans Alliance Leadership Award. Ceremony scheduled for November. Ellis sits on the selection committee for the Northern Virginia chapter." He paused. "He did not say he intended to take any action. He said, and I am quoting directly, that he wanted me to know he was aware of the full picture." I sat with that for a moment. There is a particular kind of pressure that requires no application of force. It exists simply by being known by the awareness, on the part of the person subject to it, that someone who matters is watching, and that the watching itself carries weight. Gerald did not need to receive a phone call from Ellis. He did not need a formal complaint, or a committee hearing, or a letter on official stationery. He needed only to know that Warren Ellis, who had sat on the Veterans Committee with him 3 years ago, who did not forget faces, who had been 20 feet from the entrance at 10:45 on Saturday morning, with an accidentally running camera, was now sitting in a room with my attorney, and the word aware. That was sufficient. Gerald knows Ellis is on the committee, I said. He does, Henry said. They've corresponded as recently as September regarding the award nomination process. I picked up my coffee cup. The Potomac photograph on Henry's wall showed the river in January, gray water, bare trees, the clean severity of a landscape stripped to its essential structure. I had always liked that photograph. There was nothing in it that was not exactly what it appeared to be. The demand letter, I said, 14 days. 14 days, Henry confirmed. Standard response window. If he engages constructively, we negotiate repayment terms. If he doesn't, he will, I said. Henry almost smiled. He had the same almost smile he'd had when I'd told him I had a good accountant. The expression of a man who has practiced enough law to recognize when a case has already been decided by forces outside the courtroom. He looked at the file for a moment. Then he looked at me. Richard, he said. Gerald's attorney called this office this morning. I set down my cup. 2 hours after we sent the letter, Henry said. What did they say? Henry folded his hands on the desk with the measured composure of a man delivering a line he has been waiting 3 days to deliver. They want to talk. I was in the study when the phone rang. Maggie was in the garden. I could see her through the window, moving between the raised beds she had been tending since September, a pair of pruning shears in her hand, the particular unhurried focus of a woman who has decided that things that grow deserve more attention than things that don't. She had been spending more time out there since Sunday. I understood why, and I did not interrupt it. I looked at the screen. Courtney Caldwell. She had updated her contact name since the wedding. I noted that without particular feeling and answered, Courtney, I said. Richard. Her voice was what I had expected, composed, modulated the register of a woman who had spent a decade in public relations and understood that the first 10 seconds of a conversation establish the terms of everything that follows. Thank you for picking up. I know there's a lot to work through. I was hoping we could talk. I'm listening, I said. She took that as an invitation and proceeded the way a professional proceeds when she has prepared her opening, smoothly with the appearance of spontaneity. I think what would serve everyone best right now is a structured conversation, a mediation maybe with someone neutral. I think there are perspectives on both sides that haven't been fully heard, and I'd really like the opportunity to address some of what happened at the wedding directly, as a family. She paused. I did not fill the pause. She continued, I understand there's some concern about the seating arrangements and the photography situation, and I take responsibility for the fact that those decisions weren't communicated as clearly as they should have been. If Maggie felt... Courtney, I said. She stopped. Who signed the seating revision? A silence, brief but present. The event management clause gave us authority over guest experience. Who signed it? I said. The handwritten revision on Stephen Parker's chart. Red ink. Section C. Overflow groom's parents. Who wrote those words and initialed that page? A longer silence. Who edited Tommy Reese's shot list 6 weeks before the wedding? I said. Who removed the Caldwell family from the official portrait sequence and moved them to informal shots that were never scheduled? Nothing. I have the chart, I said. I have the initials. I have a written statement from Stephen confirming the revision was made at the final walkthrough and that Daniel was present when it was submitted. I heard her breath adjust a small controlled recalibration, the sound of a woman who has just encountered a variable she had not fully accounted for. Richard, she said, and the PR register had shifted slightly, still controlled, but with the particular temperature of someone changing approach, mid-conversation. I think we got off on the wrong foot. This was never meant to be. The seating was a logistics decision, not a personal one. I never intended for Maggie to feel. The name card said, Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove Guest, I said. My wife's name has been Caldwell for 30 years. That card was printed. Someone typed those words and sent them to a printer and placed them on a table in Section C. That is not a logistics decision. Silence. I waited. When she spoke again, the shift was complete. The mediation framing was gone. What replaced it was something more direct, not quite candor, but the pragmatic honesty of a woman who has realized that the architecture she built is more visible than she had calculated. Whatever was recorded at the entrance that day, she said, it was a misunderstanding between Frank and the guest list. The tablet had an outdated version of... I stopped listening to the words. I counted to 3. She had just told me something she had not intended to tell me. Not the explanation. The explanation was exactly what I had expected, a prepared deflection about outdated guest lists and a security guard following incorrect information. What she had told me was the premise beneath the explanation, whatever was recorded. She knew about the footage. She had known before this call, which meant Stephen Parker, who had been present when Judge Ellis demonstrated the video function to his granddaughter, or who had heard about it from someone who had passed that information to Courtney at some point between Saturday afternoon and this moment. She had been managing it, factoring it into her approach, building her mediation proposal around it. I waited until she finished the sentence about Frank and the guest list. Then I said, my attorney will handle all further communication. I'd suggest you ask Gerald to do the same. A pause. Richard, I really think if we could just... Courtney, I said, I'd suggest you ask Gerald to do the same. I ended the call. I set the phone on the desk and looked out the window. Maggie was still in the garden. She had moved to the far bed, the one along the fence, where she grew the late-season herbs, and she was working with the careful attention she brought to everything that required patience. She had not heard the call. She did not know it had happened. I thought about what Courtney had just given me unintentionally in the space of 4 minutes. She knew about the footage. That was the first thing. She had been managing that information since the weekend, which meant her mediation proposal had not been an attempt at genuine reconciliation. It had been a containment strategy, an effort to bring the relevant parties into a controlled conversation before the footage became something Henry could use formally. The second thing was more interesting. Gerald's attorney had called Henry on Monday morning, 2 hours after the demand letter arrived. That was a legal response, coordinated and professional. Courtney had called me on Thursday afternoon, 4 days later, with a mediation proposal that did not mention the demand letter and did not reference Gerald's attorney. They were not coordinating. Gerald was responding through legal channels the way a man responds when his attorney has told him to. Courtney was responding through personal channels, the way a woman responds when she has decided that her interests and her father-in-law's interests are no longer identical. Something had shifted in the Hargrove household since Sunday morning, since the Marriott lobby and the folder and the third page in Diane's face when she read the number. I picked up my phone and called Henry. Courtney called, I said. I know, Henry said. She called my office 20 minutes ago as well. I didn't pick up. A pause. Richard, they're not running a unified strategy anymore. Gerald's side wants to settle. Courtney's side wants to manage the narrative. Those are 2 different problems, and they've just handed us the gap between them. I looked at Maggie through the window. The late afternoon light was on her amber and long, the same light that had been on the oak trees at Rosewood Estate when we pulled out of the parking lot 4 days ago. What do we do with the gap? I said. We wait, Henry said. 48 hours. Let them figure out they're pulling in different directions. Then we talk to Gerald's attorney on our terms. 48 hours? I said. Trust the process, Henry said. You built the foundation right. Now let it hold. Henry called at 11. I was at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the morning paper I had not actually been reading. Maggie had gone to the market, the Saturday routine she had maintained for 20 years. The same market, the same list, the same unhurried hours she had always treated as her own. The house was quiet, in the way it is quiet when you are the only person in it and you have been waiting for a call without admitting to yourself that you have been waiting. I answered before the second ring. Gerald's attorney called this morning, Henry said. They're ready to settle. I set down the coffee cup. Tell me, I said. Henry walked me through it the way he walked through everything methodically, without embellishment in the order that mattered. Gerald would repay the full principal, $99,000. Statutory interest calculated under Virginia law from the respective transfer dates, January 14th and March 7th, bringing the total to $106,200. Wire transfer to the account Carol designated to be completed within 7 business days of signed agreement. No admission of wrongdoing in the settlement language which Henry had anticipated, and which I had told him I did not require. His attorney pushed for a mutual non-disparagement clause. Henry said, I told them we'd consider it. My recommendation is to accept it binds them as much as it binds you, and you don't need to say anything publicly. You never did. Agreed, I said. There's one more thing, Henry said. His attorney asked if there were any additional conditions beyond the financial terms. I had been thinking about this since Monday, since the moment I had sat across from Gerald at the Marriott lobby table and watched Diane read the third page, and understood that the number on that page would land differently on her than any demand letter Henry could draft. Yes, I said, one condition, non-financial. Henry waited. A handwritten letter from Gerald to Maggie. Not to me, to Maggie specifically, acknowledging that he borrowed money under false pretenses and that he understands he violated the trust of this family. It does not need to be lengthy. It does not need to be public. It does not need to be seen by anyone other than her. But it needs to exist, and it needs to be in his handwriting, and it needs to reach her before the wire transfer clears. A pause. His attorney will push back on that, Henry said. I know, I said. Hold the position. Henry almost smiled. I heard it. I'll call you within the hour, he said. He called back in 40 minutes. 20 minutes of back and forth, he said. Gerald's attorney said it was unusual. I said my client's position was firm. They put me on hold. When they came back, Gerald had agreed. I looked out the kitchen window at the garden. The late October light was thin and clear, the kind of light that makes everything look exactly as it is. No warmth to soften the edges, no shadows to add depth that isn't there. Henry, I said, thank you. You did the work, he said. I just sent the letters. Daniel called at 1 o'clock. I almost didn't recognize the quality of his voice at first, not because it was different, but because it was unguarded in a way I had not heard since he was much younger. The managed distance was gone. What was left underneath it was something simpler and older. He said, I wrote Mom a letter. I was quiet for a moment. I said, I started it Sunday night, he said. After I left the house, I rewrote it 4 times. I left it in your mailbox this morning. A pause. I didn't want to call ahead. I thought if I called ahead, I'd talk myself out of it. Have you sent it? I said. It's in the mailbox, he said. I drove by about an hour ago. It's still there. Another pause shorter. I don't know if she'll read it. She'll read it, I said. I said everything, Daniel said. The planning session, the seating chart, the things I told myself so I didn't have to say anything, all of it. His voice held something I had not heard from him in years. Not guilt, exactly, but its more useful neighbor accountability, stated plainly without the protective layer of explanation. I'm not asking her to respond. I just needed her to have it. I understand, I said. Dad, a long pause. I'm sorry. I looked at the kitchen window, the garden, the thin October light. I know, I said. Work on it. Maggie came back from the market at 2. She set the bags on the counter, saw the envelope I had brought in from the mailbox and placed on the kitchen table, and looked at it for a moment without touching it. She recognized Daniel's handwriting on the front. She picked it up and looked at me. Give me a little while, she said. Take all the time you need, I said. I went to the study. I did not try to listen. I did not check the clock more than twice. What was in that letter was between Maggie and her son. It had nothing to do with routing numbers, or LLC registrations, or demand letters, or the gap between 2 people pulling in different legal directions. It was older than any of that. It belonged to them. 20 minutes later, Maggie appeared in the study doorway. She was holding the letter folded once in both hands. She looked at me with the particular expression she wore when she had decided something not impulsive, not reactive, but settled. The expression of a woman who has completed a calculation and is ready to share the result. She said, I think I'd like to go somewhere, just us, somewhere quiet. I looked at her. Where? I said. She thought about it for a moment. Somewhere we've never had to explain anything, she said. Somewhere that doesn't know our names yet. The town did not know our names. That was the first thing I noticed when we arrived. The particular anonymity of a place that has no context for you, no prior version of you to compare against, no accumulated expectation of who you are supposed to be when you walk through a door. The woman at the inn called us Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell from the reservation, and the name landed clean without the freight it had been carrying since October. Just a name, just ours. We had been here 4 days. The mornings were cold in the way that Pacific coastal mornings are cold. Not the sharp, dry cold of inland winter, but something heavier, salt-weighted, that settled into your jacket within the first minute of being outside and stayed there. We had developed the habit of taking our coffee to the small wooden deck that faced the water, wrapped in the heavy wool blankets the inn provided, watching the light come up over the ocean in the particular slow way it does. When there is no horizon line, you recognize no landmark to tell you where you are. Maggie had her hands around her cup. I had mine. The waves came in at intervals that had nothing to do with anything we had left behind in Virginia. The wire transfer had cleared on October 27th. Henry had called to confirm $106,200, exactly as agreed received, in the account Carol had designated. He said Gerald's attorney had been professional throughout. He said the non-disparagement agreement had been signed by all parties. He said with the particular brevity of a man who knows when a case is finished, "It's done, Richard. Well done." I had thanked him and ended the call. Then I had sat in the study for a while, looking at the Potomac photograph I had been thinking about since I sat across from it in Henry's office in October. I had been thinking for longer than that about what the money meant now that it was back. Not what it represented. I had known what it represented since March. What it meant going forward. What the right shape of it was. The answer had not taken long to find. I called Carol the following morning. "The full amount," I said, $106,200. "I want to establish a scholarship fund. Civil Engineering, Virginia Tech." A pause. "It will be called the Margaret and Richard Caldwell Scholarship. Named for my father, who taught me what the word structure actually means." Carol was quiet for a moment. "I'll have the paperwork started by end of week," she said. "Thank you, Carol," I said, "for everything this year." Another pause. The brief professional pause of a woman who has been doing this work long enough to know that some thank yous are larger than they sound. "It was straightforward," she said. "You gave me clean data." Daniel called on a Tuesday in November. Not a long call. Not a difficult one. He called the way a person calls when they have nothing specific to report, and no particular agenda, when the call itself is the point, the simple act of maintaining a connection that has been stressed and has not yet fully healed, but has not broken either. He asked about the trip. I told him we were thinking about the coast. He said that sounded right. He asked about Maggie. I said she was well. He said he was glad. Before he hung up, he said, "Dad, I'm working on it." I knew what he meant. I had told him to work on it in October, and he was reporting in the way he had reported in on things that mattered to him since he was old enough to understand that some efforts require acknowledgement even before they are complete. "I know you are," I said. "Keep going." I did not ask about Courtney. He did not mention her. Some things find their own pace, and the pace was not mine to set. On our third morning at the coast, Maggie walked down to the water. I watched her from the deck. She went slowly the way she moved on uneven ground, now careful, unhurried, her jacket collar up against the wind. She walked to the place where the waves reached their highest point on the sand, and stopped there at the edge of what the ocean could touch. She bent down and picked up a stone. A small one, flat, pale gray, the kind of stone that coasts produce by the millions through the patient, indifferent work of water on rock. She held it in her palm for a moment, turned it once, and then stood straight and looked out at the water. She did not throw it. She put it in her jacket pocket and stood there for a while, the waves coming in around the toes of her boots, the gray ocean going out to the gray horizon, the wind moving through her hair. I did not go down to join her. Some moments are not yours to enter. I thought sitting on that deck with my cold coffee about what I understood now that I had not understood. In January or March, or on the morning I had driven to Rosewood Estate in a suit I had pressed the night before because I wanted to look right for my son's wedding, I understood that structures reveal themselves under load, that the crack you didn't see in the blueprint shows up the first time the weight is applied, and that this is not a failure of the structure, it is information. It is the building telling you what it is made of. I understood that the most important thing I had done all year was not the demand letter or the authorization hold or the 3 phone calls from the West Corridor of a Napa Valley estate. The most important thing I had done was stay level, stay precise. Not perform anger when I felt it. Not perform forgiveness when I didn't. Not collapse the distance between what was true and what was convenient. Maggie was walking back up the beach now. The stone was in her pocket. Her hands were free. I did not know how much she had forgiven Daniel. I did not know if forgiven was even the right word for what she was working her way toward. Forgiveness belongs to the person doing it. It is not a transaction, not a balance sheet, not something a third party can document or verify or claim credit for facilitating. Whatever Maggie carried or released on that beach was hers. It had always been hers. She came up the steps to the deck and sat down beside me. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. The ocean moved. The light shifted. Somewhere down the coast, invisible in the morning haze, there was a town that knew other people's names and held other people's histories, and was occupied as all places are, with the ordinary, serious business of continuing. We sat there for a long time. We did not need to say anything, and that the silence that required no explanation, the morning that asked nothing of us, the simple fact of two people sitting together on the far side of a hard year with their hands around their cups and the water in front of them, that was enough. It was, I thought, exactly enough. I have thought about this a great deal, sitting on that deck with the cold coffee and the sound of the ocean. Someone once told me that God doesn't remove the weight, he changes who's carrying it. I think that's true. I didn't pray for Gerald to lose. I didn't pray for Daniel to suffer. I prayed quietly and without much eloquence to carry what was mine and release what wasn't. The ocean helped with that. So did Maggie's stone. Here's what I know now that I didn't know in January. This was a family betrayal I could have seen earlier and didn't, because I confused generosity with trust and silence with peace. The family betrayal taught me that the people who smile at your table are not always the people who see you. And the family betrayal cost me something I will not fully measure. If you are sitting somewhere recognizing pieces of this story in your own life, don't do what I did. Don't wait until the wedding. Don't fund the room that erases your name. Speak earlier. The dad revenge fantasy feels clean, in hindsight, but living it was never about revenge. It was about recovering something that should never have been taken. Real dad revenge isn't a scene. It's documentation, patience, and knowing when to turn the valve. The truest dad revenge is simply refusing to disappear. My personal opinion, loyalty that requires your silence isn't loyalty, it's management. If any part of this story stayed with you, the bouquet, nobody photographed the name card, the stone Maggie didn't throw, leave a comment below. Tell me what hit hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the story that earns that click. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements constructed for the sole purpose of exploring what it means to live with integrity. If that's not the content for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you. But if you're still here, I think you already know why.